Joe Biden is responsible for saving America's auto industry, and you voted against it.
Joe Biden has been a cheerleader for communist China over the last several decades.
There were fine people on both sides. This is who we have as the President of the United States. And America, you deserve better.
President Trump has Jewish grandchildren.
Vice President Mike Pence and Senator Kamala Harris squared off in the vice presidential debate of the 2020 election on October 7th. The event was moderated by Susan Page of USA Today and was held at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. While the vice presidential debates are, generally speaking, totally inconsequential to the results of presidential elections, this one may have been a little different for a number of reasons. The advanced ages of both presidential candidates increases the odds that their VP might have to step into the role of the presidency. Donald Trump's recent COVID diagnosis certainly underlines this point. The future prospects of a Vice President Kamala Harris are also especially significant, given the possibility teased by his campaign during the primary season that Biden may decide to serve only a single term if elected president. Also adding to the significance of the VP debate is the fact that the first presidential debate was terrible, and that the president has recently pulled out from the second presidential debate and requested to postpone by a week, an offer swiftly rejected by the Biden camp. The proposed Miami debate, to be moderated by Steve Scully, is now officially canceled. In this video, I'll break down the 2020 election's vice presidential debate. I'll highlight key moments, assess who I think won the debate, and talk about how American voters responded to the event. Although, let's be honest, even with the heightened significance of this debate, I highly doubt it will have an actual strong impact on the outcome of the election. I mean, would it change your vote?
Newsweek magazine said that Kamala Harris was the most liberal member of the United States Senate in 2019, more liberal than Bernie Sanders.
Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking.
I'm speaking. Are you and Joe Biden going to pack the court if Judge Amy Coney Barrett is confirmed?
There's a weird obsession that President Trump has had with getting rid of whatever accomplishment was achieved by President Obama and Vice President Biden.
The issue of racial justice.
I just want the record to reflect she never answered the question.
Let's talk about the polls coming out of the vice presidential debate. The first poll I want to mention is definitely the worst, but worth mentioning because of how dumb it was. USA Today's Twitter feed made a very stupid mistake, tweeting out a poll that forgot to mention Mike Pence as a polling option. Now that would just be a fun story about a dumb tweet, but of course Ted Cruz had to ruin it by citing the blunder as evidence that the media has an agenda. Fortunately, USA Today corrected the error and attached a demonstration of self-deprecating humor, which I appreciate. Of course, you should not take any Twitter poll seriously in any circumstances, they're just for fun. And a little advice for Senator Cruz, remember always Hanlon's razor. Never attribute to malice that which can adequately be explained by stupidity. A far more reliable poll would be the one conducted by SSRS and CNN, which has been widely cited. This one found that respondents thought Harris beat Pence 59% to 38%. However, as a baseline comparison, their pre-debate polling found respondents expected Harris to beat Pence 61% to 36%, meaning that Harris underperformed expectations by a statistically insignificant margin. The margin of error for this study is plus or minus 5.3 points. Finally, let's talk about the VP debate study by Ipsos and 538, which is far more detailed and has a slimmer margin of error of just plus or minus 2 percentage points. This study asked about debate performance and found 69% of respondents thought that Kamala Harris had a good performance, compared to a similar 60% who thought that Pence did well. Interestingly, both Pence and Harris improved their overall favorability scores after the debate. This is probably a result of the fact that they both managed to behave like grown-ups for most of the hour-and-a-half debate, a feat that seems to have eluded the tops of the tickets. The most important question, of course, is how the evening might change voting behavior, and on this front, it's clear that the debate made absolutely no change. Both before and after the debate, Harris scored a 5.1 average, and Pence scored a 3.8 average. So like I said, there's reasons why this might be a more important than usual VP debate, but it's still a VP debate. which means that pretty much no one changed their votes as a result of the night. Still, I would like to assign a winner to this debate, so let's begin breaking down some of the most critical moments of the debate. I'm also going to use this opportunity to point out some of the more egregious false statements, but to be clear, I'm only going to make my determination based on who argued the most effectively. Unfortunate as it may be, lying doesn't really make you a less effective debater. If that were so, 90% of politicians and political pundits would be unemployed. Okay, so let's start with the moment that is most likely to be remembered from this debate, a moment that is surely getting the most buzz across social media.
Is a great insult to the men and women who serve in law enforcement. And I want everyone to know who puts on the uniform of law enforcement every day that President Trump and I stand with you.
Yeah, so there was a fly and it landed on Mike Pence. Not going to deduct any points from the VP for this. The optics aren't particularly great when you consider what flies tend to land on, but it's in no way a flaw in his performance. I will give a shout out to Joe Biden's social media team though for finding a way to be genuinely funny about this, while also using that funny to collect campaign contributions. Point being, we can already hand out some meaningless W's. W for Biden's social media team, W for the fly, W for the people who created Twitter accounts for the fly within 24 hours of the fly's launch to worldwide stardom. We can also hand out some L's. An L certainly goes to USA Today for their very stupid poll, an L goes to Ted Cruz for having no sense of humor, and another L goes to USA Today for employing Susan Page, who gets a significant L for her poor moderating.
Well, and
Susan,
I want to make sure we have a chance
I really have to
talk
respond
about,
to that. Look, she has
15 seconds because
Well, I gotta
we're
have
trying
more
to
than
keep.
that. Look.
Well, I'm sorry, but Vice President
Look,
Pence, you've had more time than
look,
she's
the-
had
the
so far.
Slanders against President Donald Trump.
Plenty of people criticized Chris Wallace for his inability to control the first presidential debate, even though the chaos was largely caused by the presidential candidates themselves, most especially Donald Trump. The decorum of Susan Page's debate says nothing about her abilities as a moderator. Things were only more controlled at the VP debate because Harris and Pence had far more discipline. Page was, in my opinion, a terrible moderator, as she issued no fact-checking or even follow-up questions when candidates lied or totally dodged her questions. You'll see more evidence of this throughout this video as we now narrow in on the performances of the actual VP candidates, Kamala Harris and Mike Pence. So let's begin with the first line delivered by a candidate in this debate, Kamala Harris's response to Susan Page's question about how Joe Biden would respond differently to the COVID pandemic.
Well, the American people have witnessed what is the greatest failure of any presidential administration in the history of our country.
I know Harris has gotten a lot of credit for the strength of that opening line, but I don't personally agree. I mean, really listen to that line.
The American people have witnessed what is the greatest failure of any presidential administration in the history of our country.
Really, the greatest presidential failure in the history of our country. Worse than the invasion of Iraq or ignoring warnings about 9/11. Worse than Japanese internment camps or Hiroshima. Worse than the Iran-Contra affair. Worse than Watergate. Worse than allowing the Vietnam War to intensify. Worse than the failure to prevent southern states from seceding from the Union. Worse than giving the longest inaugural address in American history up until that point on a cold and wet day without wearing an overcoat or hat. Anyway, beyond what I take to be a hyperbolic opening line, this actually was very likely her strongest moment in the entire debate. And it's definitely a good thing to get your strong moments in at the beginning, while everyone's still watching.
210,000 dead people in our country in just the last several months. Over 7 million people who have contracted this disease. 1 in 5 businesses closed. We're looking at frontline workers who have been treated like sacrificial workers. We are looking at over 30 million people who in the last several months had to file for unemployment. And here's the thing. On January 28th, the Vice President and the President were informed about the nature of this pandemic. They were informed that it's lethal in consequence, that it is airborne, that it will affect young people, and that it would be contracted because it is airborne. And they knew what was happening and they didn't tell you. Can you imagine if you knew on January 28th, as opposed to March 13th, what they knew, what you might have done to prepare? They knew and they covered it up. The president said it was a hoax. They minimized the seriousness of it. The president said, you're on one side of his ledger if you wear a mask, you're on the other side of his ledger if you don't. And in spite of all of that, today they still don't have a plan. They still don't have a plan. Well, Joe Biden does. And our plan is about what we need to do around a national strategy for contact tracing, for testing, for administration of the vaccine, and making sure that it will be free for all. That is the plan that Joe Biden has and that I have, knowing that we have to get a hold of what has been going on, and we need to save our country. And Joe Biden is the best leader to do that, and frankly, this administration has forfeited their right to re-election based on this.
Thank you, Senator Harris.
The one downside to Harris's answer is that despite forcefully criticizing Trump about his past failures on COVID, she was not very clear about how Biden's plan would be different going forward from the one that Trump is proposing. And that was the central thrust of the question she was asked. Pence's response to a similar question on the same topic actually narrowed in on the differences, and for this reason I think was even more effective.
That from the very first day, President Donald Trump has put the health of America first. Before, there were more than 5 cases in the United States, all people who had returned from China. President Donald Trump did what no other American president had ever done, and that was he suspended all travel from China, the second largest economy in the world. Now, Senator Joe Biden opposed that decision. He said it was xenophobic and hysterical. But I can tell you, having led the White House Coronavirus Task Force, that decision alone by President Trump bought us invaluable time to stand up the greatest national mobilization since World War II.
Painting a distinction where Trump allegedly got it right makes Pence's argument for the president far more effective. That said, it's essentially all built on lies. According to the Associated Press, Trump didn't ban all travel from China, he merely restricted it. Biden had frequently called Trump xenophobic, but he actually never opposed the travel restrictions on China at the time. In fact, in April, his campaign actually came out in support of the travel restrictions if guided by medical experts. Anyway, here's a little more from Pence's response.
The reality is, when you look at the Biden plan, it reads an awful lot like what President Trump and I and our task force have been doing every step of the way. I mean, quite frankly, when I look at their plan that talks about advancing testing, creating new PPE, developing a vaccine, it looks a little bit like plagiarism, which is something Joe Biden knows a little bit about.
Dude, that was a very good line. Not only did Biden have to drop out from his first run as president after plagiarism scandal, ripping off speeches from other politicians, he even got in trouble back in law school for plagiarism. Another strong point made by Pence was picking up from Trump's debate criticism of Biden over H1N1. When Trump did it, he failed to articulate a good argument, which I thought was counterproductive because he left Americans simply thinking which was worse. And obviously, the natural conclusion would be that swine flu was handled better because it did not lead to nearly as much harm as did the coronavirus. But Pence takes the same comparison and successfully turns it into an argument that the Obama-Biden administration did worse in handling that virus.
We actually do know what failure looks like in a pandemic. It was 2009. The swine flu arrived in the United States. Thankfully, it ended up not being as lethal as the coronavirus. But before the end of the year, when Joe Biden was Vice President of the United States, not 7.5 million people contracted the swine flu. 60 million Americans contracted the swine flu. If the swine flu had been as lethal as the coronavirus, in 2009, when Joe Biden was Vice President, we would have lost 2 million American lives.
Mind you, it's a deceptive argument for a number of reasons. For one thing, the lower lethality rate of swine flu was precisely the reason it was allowed to spread more. While U.S. health officials originally recommended school closures to help control the spread of the disease, in May of 2005, Health and Human Services Secretary Kathleen Sebelius said that the disease was milder than originally suspected, and thus the government changed its advice on school closures. So it's actually a very bizarre comparison when you put a little bit of thought into it. According to the National Center for Health Statistics, there are over 62 million cases of the common cold per year, and the government does nothing to prevent this. Now, 62 million is far more than the 7.6 million cases recorded for COVID. Should we be criticizing the Trump administration for not doing anything about the common cold when they knew about the virus even before Trump took office? No, we shouldn't, because the rhinovirus is not Ebola. The average American adult, in fact, manages to survive 2 to 3 colds per year, according to the CDC. Obviously, the disease is fairly benign in terms of its effects. The number of infected people alone, therefore, says nothing about how a government should respond to an outbreak. You actually have to look at the lethality, too, if you want to make a reasonable assessment for how to respond, or a reasonable argument assessing a government's response to a pandemic. So Pence's argument here is significantly flawed, but I do concede that I can see how the fallacious reasoning would be missed by a lot of people. So again, I'll give him a low score for logic, but a high score for persuasiveness. Kamala Harris also made some points relating to COVID, which were highly persuasive, but not entirely intellectually valid.
There's a weird obsession that President Trump has had with getting rid of whatever accomplishment was achieved by President Obama and Vice President Biden. For example, they created within the White House an office that basically was responsible for monitoring pandemics. They got rid of it.
Not true.
There was a team of disease experts that President Obama and Vice President Biden dispatched to China to monitor what is now predictable and what might happen. They pulled them out. We now are looking at 210,000 Americans who have lost their lives.
That's not exactly false, but it is misleading. It's become a bit of a meme on social media that President Trump fired the entire pandemic response team in 2018. In reality, Obama's pandemic preparedness team, the Global Health Security and Biodefense Unit, set up in 2015 by Susan Rice, was disbanded by the Trump administration in 2018, and several members of the team departed the administration under streamlining efforts under John Bolton. However, many of the team members remained in the National Security Council and were reassigned to roles that included pandemic response. According to John Bolton, global health remained a top priority for the NSC. Also on the COVID topic, Susan Page asked Pence a question so pointed that, to be honest with you, I would not have known how to answer this if I were the vice president.
Vice President Pence, you were in the front row in a Rose Garden event 11 days ago, what seems to have been a super spreader event for senior administration and congressional officials. No social distancing, few masks, and now a cluster of coronavirus cases among those who were there. How can you expect Americans to follow the administration's safety guidelines to protect themselves from COVID when you at the White House have not been doing so?
So in other words, you and the administration completely ignored your own rules, and now the president is sick. How do you expect people to trust you on this issue? If it were me, I'd probably say something like, it's true, we were so focused on trying to help the country through this crisis that we were reckless with our own health. This shows that we should be more cautious, and indeed that the guidelines must be followed by everyone. But I'm not Mike Pence. Rather than address the central focus of the question, he narrowed in only on the part about Americans following guidelines.
Well, the American people have demonstrated over the last 8 months that when given the facts, they're willing to put the health of their families and their neighbors and people they don't even know first. And President Trump and I have great confidence in the American people and their ability to take that information.
For full disclosure, Pence would go on in his 2-minute response to briefly mention that the event was outside and involved testing, but that was rushed by and sandwiched with repeated statements about trusting and respecting the American people. Shameless? Yes, but effective? I expect it was. Kamala Harris did a relatively strong response as well, citing Pence's claim to respecting the American people.
Let's talk about respecting the American people. You respect the American people when you tell them the truth. You respect the American people when you have the courage
Which we've
to be a
always
leader,
done.
speaking of those things that you may not want people to hear, but they need to hear so they can protect themselves. But this administration stood on information that if you had as a parent, if you had as a worker knowing you didn't have enough money saved up, and now you're standing in a food line because of the ineptitude of an administration that was unwilling to speak the truth to the American people.
Still, what Harris's response missed was calling out Pence for the dodge. and the fact that their recklessness led to the president contracting the virus, a proposition that would have been easy to hit Pence with since it was built into the grammar of the original question. There was actually a recurring motif throughout the debate with this respect. Repeatedly, Pence was asked questions which he did not answer, and generally speaking, Kamala Harris did not call him out for dodging the question, nor did the moderator, Susan Page.
Vice President Pence, have you had a conversation or reached an agreement with President Trump about safeguards or procedures when it comes to the issue of presidential disability? And if not, do you think you should? You have 2 minutes without interruption.
Well, Susan, thank you, although I would like to go back.
I think we need to move on to the issue of...
Well, thank you, but I would like to go back.
You know, neither President Trump nor Vice President Biden has released a sort of detailed health information that had become the modern norm until the 2016 election. And my question to each of you in turn is this information voters deserve to know? Vice President Pence, would you like to go first?
Well, Susan, thank you. And let me say, on behalf of the President and the First Lady, how moved we've all been by the outpouring of prayers and concern.
Do you believe, as the scientific community has concluded, that man-made climate change has made wildfires bigger, hotter, and more deadly, and have made hurricanes wetter, slower, and more damaging? You have 2 minutes uninterrupted.
Thank you, Susan. Well, first, I'm very proud of our record on the environment and on conservation. According to all of the best estimates, our air and land are cleaner than any time ever recorded, and our water is among the cleanest in the world.
If Vice President Biden is declared the winner and President Trump refuses to accept a peaceful transfer of power, what would be your role and responsibility as Vice President? What would you personally do? You have 2 minutes.
Well, Susan, first and foremost, I think we're going to win this election.
How would you describe our fundamental relationship with China? Competitors, adversaries, enemies? You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Susan. Well, before I leave that, let me speak to voting records if I can.
Would you want your home state to ban all abortions? You have 2 minutes, uninterrupted.
Well, thank you for the question, but I'll use a little bit of my time to respond to that very important issue before.
How would your administration protect Americans with pre-existing conditions to have access to affordable insurance if the Affordable Care Act is struck down?
Well, thank you, Susan, but let me just say, addressing your very first question.
Kamala Harris also dodged some questions, but less frequently and to a lesser extent. Generally speaking, I think that average voters are likely to miss the question dodging, so it isn't likely to harm either candidate. There was, however, one moment in which Pence dodged a question from the moderator, then used the opportunity to ask Harris his own question.
When you speak about the Supreme Court, though, I think the American people really deserve an answer, Senator Harris. Are you and Joe Biden going to pack the court if Judge Amy Coney Barrett is confirmed? I mean, there have been 29 vacancies on the Supreme Court during presidential election years, from George Washington to Barack Obama. Presidents have nominated in all 29 cases. But your party is actually openly advocating adding seats to the Supreme Court, which has had 9 seats for 150 years, if you don't get your way. This is a classic case of if you can't win by the rules, you're going to change the rules. Now, you've refused to answer the question. Joe Biden has refused to answer the question. So I think the American people would really like to know, if Judge Amy Coney Barrett is confirmed to the Supreme Court of the United States, are you and Joe Biden, if somehow you win this election, going to pack the Supreme Court to get your way?
This was, in my view, abrasive enough that a typical voter will likely note the poor decorum of Mike Pence. I mean, it is pretty obnoxious for a candidate to refuse a moderator's question while demanding that the opposing candidate answer his own questions. But the average American is also liable to care more about the substance than the form, and in terms of policy, Pence has successfully identified and highlighted an area where the Biden-Harris ticket is probably going to continue to be evasive for the rest of the election. When it comes to court packing, liberals and progressives are very likely to support Democratic court packing, whereas never-Trump Republicans are likely to detest the idea. So putting pressure on Biden and Harris for their lack of transparency on this issue is definitely a strong tactic to pursue. Turning now to foreign policy, Pence made an argument I'm honestly surprised that you don't hear more often from the president.
You know, when President Trump came into office, ISIS had captured an area of the Middle East the size of Pennsylvania. But President Trump unleashed the American military, and our armed forces destroyed the ISIS caliphate and took down their leader al-Baghdadi without one American casualty.
There's no doubt that this is a strong talking point for the president. although it's somewhat undermined by this argument Pence made almost immediately after bragging about the defeat of the so-called Islamic State.
And when Qasem Soleimani was traveling to Baghdad to do harm to Americans, President Donald Trump took him out.
Thank you, Vice President Pence.
And America is safer, our allies are safer, and the American people know President Donald Trump will never
Thank you, Vice President
take
Pence.
action.
Of course, Iran has played more than a small role in fighting ISIS, so bragging on the one hand about defeating Daesh and on the other about assassinating an Iranian general is, well, complicated to say the least. Indeed, plenty of military analysts have argued that conflicts with Iran undermine the fight against IS. The director of Middle East program at Center for a New American Security even went so far as saying that the assassination of Soleimani was a victory for ISIS, because it was the unlikely coalition between the United States and Iran that pushed ISIS back. I was curious to see what Americans thought about the matter, and found pretty confusing results in a study by Ipsos and USA Today. According to that study, 24% of Americans thought the strike made the US more safe, while 55% thought it made the country less safe. Still, 42% supported it overall, compared to just 33% who opposed it. Respondents also believed overwhelmingly, 52% to 34%, that Trump's behavior with Iran has been reckless. So it appears that the average American thinks the assassination made the US less safe and was part of a pattern of reckless behavior, which they support. So I suppose the average voter is sort of on Trump's side on this, but are confused enough to be convinced otherwise. Unfortunately, I don't think Harris provided an argument that would get that job done.
So after the strike on Soleimani, there was a counter strike on our troops in Iraq, and they suffered serious brain injuries. And do you know what Donald Trump dismissed them as? Headaches. And this is about a pattern of Donald Trump's, where he has referred to our men who are serving in our military as suckers and losers.
So yeah, highlighting the blowback was a step in the right direction, but I don't think it's particularly helpful to point out that Trump has said outrageous things about members of the military. Everyone knows about his statements about John McCain, for example.
Let's take what he said about John McCain, a great American hero.
For some reason, Democrats seem to always want to bring things back to how Trump has said mean or stupid things, which highlight his lack of civility, which most Americans I don't think care about at all. Harris should have pushed the point that I mentioned, that the strike undermined cooperation with Iran to eliminate a worse threat. And she should have highlighted the fact that when the US assassinates military leaders, it gives adversaries and enemies an excuse to do the same to US military leaders. The move further destabilized the region, created new tensions between US and Iraq, and did literally nothing to make Iran a less dangerous rogue nation. A missed opportunity in my view, but I can't say I'm entirely surprised. Still, Kamala Harris articulated a number of very strong attacks on President Trump. For one thing, she used the recently leaked Trump taxes to undermine trust in the president.
When I first heard about it, I literally said, "You mean $750,000? And it was like, no, $750. We now know Donald Trump owes and is in debt for $400 million. And just so everyone is clear, when we say in debt, it means you owe money to somebody. And it'd be really good to know who the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, owes money to, because the American people have a right to know what is influencing the president's decisions. And is he making those decisions on the best interest of the American people, of you, or self-interest?
Indeed, while on the surface it might seem like a juicier story that Trump paid very little in taxes, the idea that he owes considerable debts is certainly potentially worrisome. Harris also made a point about how Biden measures the health of the economy compared to how Trump does the same, which I found somewhat reminiscent of a frequent refrain from Andrew Yang.
Joe Biden believes you measure the health and the strength of America's economy based on the health and the strength of the American worker and the American family. On the other hand, you have Donald Trump, who measures the strength of the economy based on how rich people are doing, which is why he passed a tax bill benefiting the top 1% and the biggest corporations of America, leading to a $2 trillion deficit that the American people are going to have to pay for.
Kamala Harris also, I believe, benefited from a tactical error committed by Pence. On the one hand, he defined her as the leftiest liberal in the Senate, quoting, of course, the nation's magazine of record, Newsweek.
But Senator, you said it didn't go far enough on climate change, that you put your radical environmental agenda ahead of American auto workers and ahead of American jobs. The American people deserve to know that. Is probably why Newsweek magazine said that Kamala Harris was the most liberal member of the United States Senate in 2019. More liberal than Bernie Sanders, more liberal than any of the others in the United States Senate.
And yet, while criticizing Harris for being too liberal, he also criticized her for not being liberal enough.
When you were Attorney General of California, you increased the disproportionate incarceration of blacks in California. You did nothing on criminal justice reform in California.
Harris, of course, pushed back on this, noting fairly familiar points to those of us who follow the Democratic primary debates.
I was the first statewide officer to institute a requirement that my agents would wear body cameras and keep them on full time. We were the first to initiate a requirement that there would be a training for law enforcement on implicit bias because, yes, Joe Biden and I recognize that implicit bias does exist, Mr. Vice President, contrary to what you may believe.
At any rate, by attacking Harris for being both too liberal and not liberal enough, he fails to paint a coherent image of who he's attacking for the viewers at home. It's a similar mistake as the one made by Trump by calling Biden a puppet of the radical left and then accusing him of losing the left at the first presidential debate. Bit of a swing and a miss, in my view. A debate-wide error committed by Harris, I think, was the way in which she confronted Pence when he interrupted her speaking.
Well, let's get
no, but Susan, this is important.
Susan,
I want to add, but Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking.
I'm
speaking. He will not raise taxes on anybody who makes less than $400,000 a year.
He said he's going to repeal the Trump tax cuts.
Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking.
Well, wait.
I'm speaking.
It'd be important if you said the truth.
If you don't mind letting me finish, we can then have a conversation, okay?
Please.
Okay. In 1864...
Well, I'd like you to answer the question.
No, Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking. I'm speaking. Okay. Yeah, let's talk about packing the court then. Let's talk about the fact... Yeah, I'm about to.
Now look, Pence was wrong every time he began speaking over Kamala Harris during her time. And she certainly had to push back in those moments to demonstrate strength and to prevent herself from getting bulldozed. But personally, I felt that because she kept striking exactly the same tone and demeanor with that move, it made her seem a little over-rehearsed. And the tone seemed a little too condescending in the moment, and perhaps a bit too hostile, given that while Pence was certainly rude to interrupt, she wasn't really at risk of being silenced by him. Indeed, according to CNN, the total speaking time for each candidate was almost exactly equal. Now, I'm sure that plenty of people probably loved the way that she pushed back. It sat a little odd for me. It seemed like she was putting more energy into pushing him back than into the actual message she was trying to send to the American people. But again, I'm sure there are different opinions on this, and I fully confess it's a tricky balance to find, and I'm sure it's a minor point either way. Overall, while the first presidential debate was, in my view, not a total blowout, the vice presidential debate was much closer. Both candidates made some very captivating arguments and some very poor arguments. Both made false or misleading statements. Both had uncomfortable moments, and both managed to speak, for the most part, like grown-ups for a full hour and a half. It seems to me natural to compare the running mates to the tops of the tickets, and Harris certainly managed to stay on message and had plenty of positive things to say about her party's nominee. Pence did the same, but he also took it a step further, at several points taking relatively incoherent arguments made by the president during the first presidential debate and reforming them into fairly persuasive points. In general, I think Pence did more to control the conversation and successfully manipulated Susan Page's poor moderating skills to drive home the messages he wanted to put out there. For this reason, he was able to, I think, squeeze out a victory at the vice presidential debate. Now, I've seen Kamala Harris channel great energy and charisma in previous engagements, but she simply didn't do it here. She kept the evening rather dry, a tone that Pence pretty much lives in. His performance reminded me of why Trump's team selected him as a running mate. He stays on message with Trump, but projects the opposite tone. He's calm, collected, and traditionally presidential. His ability to translate the Trump line into a tenor that old-school Republicans can appreciate makes him an invaluable asset for Team Trump. Still, if you're a Democrat, you can rejoice. Since the debate, we've continued to see Biden rise in the national polls as Trump has continued to decline. The spread is now over 10 points in Biden's favor, according to RCP's aggregations. This could look like counter evidence to my suggestion that Pence won the debate, but let's be honest with ourselves. Had the VP debate been a total blowout in either direction, would it change your vote?